known each other for half a century. We were both around in the early days of Centerprise, which was set up in 1970 by an American, Glenn Thompson, who was immersed in the community activism, which really was much more a feature of America in the 60s, and then came to England subsequently. And it was a bookshop, it was a cafe, it was a place where activists, agitprop people met and exchanged ideas. It was an artistic workshop, and it was also became a place which articulated and published voices from below, or ordinary East Londoners. Voices from below was not a new concept, but it wasn't really something that people had done to any extent in the poorer parts of London, although Chris Searle's Stepney Worms was very much a simultaneous phenomenon. And Ken, who at the time was a full-time teacher at Hackney Downs, really led on the publishing project and the gathering of voices, and there were several books for which he has main responsibility, including Dr Jelley, which was taken from memories in the 1970s, when Dr Jelley was still recoverable in the memories of older people. 10 years later it would have been very, very difficult. 20 years later it would have been completely incredible. And one of the books that I moves me even now is a book of poetry by a boy called Vivian Usherwood, which some of you may have seen. A very beautiful book, very sad poems, and he tragically died young. So Ken gave up teaching in 1973, subsequently worked with his pen and has done a huge amount of work in bringing to the fore all manner of writers, and some of you may have heard him speak in other capacities. I think that since this work was done in the early 70s on Dr Jelley, in which I was very peripherally involved, Ken has come up with more material about Dr Jelley from other sources. So I think what we're here was a kind of a mixture of memories and subsequent documentary information. Is that more or less right, Ken?
That's fine, yeah.
Have I been over the top or off the mark in any way? Right, I'll sit down on the cushions there and welcome Ken.
Yes, thank you. One of another founder member of the People's Autobiography Group. And in looking, preparing for this talk tonight, I was going through my box files, and I actually did find this poster, which was the original poster for setting up the first meeting of the People's Autobiography of Hackney Group on the 27th of September. I didn't know which year it was, but you can obviously with Google find out immediately, and it is definitely 1972. The two particularly interesting things about this, one is that it says it's going to be a project, three interesting things. A project using tape recorders and cameras to collect people's experience of schools and education. That's clearly the result of many of us, Anna was there, I was there, attending the 1972 Ruskin History Workshop on childhood, which was attended by 500 people the weekend, sleeping all over the shop, eating all over the shop. It was like a kind of carnival of the revolution. And the theme was childhood, and some of us came back from that who'd been there and decided, well, this was something that we would start with. But very soon we got sidetracked with lots of other things once we started to get interested in that. The second thing is that it's a project using tape recorders and cameras. The other big influence on some of us who were working in education at that time was John Berger's and Jean Moore's book, A Fortunate Man, the combination of photography and text and manuscript seemed to us a kind of revolutionary, or a much more expansive way of trying to record everyday life and experience. So the cameras didn't come out for a while, but they certainly did come out very quickly, as you know, because I think in the next 3 years 2 volumes came out called Working Lives Volume 1, Working Lives Volume 2, which were both books about different trades and occupations in Hackney, that were accompanied by a photo essay by photographers who were then active in Hackney. And the third thing that it reminded me of this, apart from the fact that it spelled my name wrong, was that it says introduced by Ken Worpole. We were very keen then to get the imprimatur of the Workers' Education Association. The Hackney branch had died a few years before, so we applied to re-establish Hackney branch, which was fine. But when we put the proposal that this was going to be a history workshop, and they said, well, who's going to be the tutor? And I said, well, I am, but I don't have a history degree, I don't have a degree. And I couldn't therefore go on their panel. And the compromise was that it would be a workshop and I would be the convener. So I didn't have to need to have any intellectual background, just simply a kind of administrative background to do it. But those 3 things kind of were part of the zeitgeist then, which I wanted to talk about as a way of opening up this. And with Anna, I hope she'll say something very soon, her memories of those early days, because we did think we were kind of really, things were changing. Another factor, of course, the technology. We had no money, we used cheap cassette tape recorders with built-in microphones. And they were okay, but I do remember the first evening, and I don't know if you're there, Anna, when I went with one of my school students, Pete Yates, to interview a man, a shoemaker, former shoemaker in Hackney. And when we played the tape back, first thing you heard was the budgerigar. And the problem with pickup mics or built-in mics is that they go for the highest register. They kind of tune in. So throughout the hours of the interview, you have the budgerigar chirping away, and we had to decipher against that. And then towards the end of the hour, there was an amazing rattle of teacups. As you know, it was great. People brought in, the tea tray with the cake stand and everything. It was wonderful, but we hadn't worked that one out. The other thing, now you do remember this, Anna? Very early on, someone came to the group and said, "Do you know what? If you take one of these cassette tapes on the underground, it erases it." Did you get?
There was that, and also if you went through an electric shop door.
That's right. That's right. There were these mythologies around what you could and where you could or could not take a cassette tape without it being
endangering it.
Wiped out. And I generally did. I mean, not take tapes on the underground.
That's right.
Is that actually true, Ken? I mean, I've heard that before. I'm not.
No, it's not true. It's not true. And lastly, and this was really important, we relied heavily on the then newspaper, well, still the Hackney Gazette, which came out on Tuesdays and Fridays. It was a very thick newspaper. It was avidly read by people. It was full of advertisements for jobs, lots of jobs in the trade, buy and sell things, personal ads and so on. But the letters page was always full of people asking, or do you remember this sort of thing? And the minute we put a letter in saying, would you like to talk about the shoe trade or something like that, we would get quite a lot of postcards or letters back. And in one of the very first 2 or 3 interviews, we were told about Dr Jelley, completely unknown to us, this eccentric doctor who rode around on a horseback but was idolised by many of the poor people of Hackney when he was practising in basically between 1912 and 1916 when he went to prison. But Anna, do you have any other memories of those early days before we actually launched into Jelley? I mean,
well, I'd just like to say that the new technology of the cassette tape recorder was incredibly important because it was affordable and it was portable, and even despite the terrifying scarce stories where you couldn't take your tapes, it was a very new thing to be able to. I had one because an American friend had been visiting in the late 60s, and he just got it for a toy, and he spent Christmas with me and my family and decided to give me the tape recorder, partly so he didn't have to carry it back, I think, but also because I was so excited by it. So before the group started, I'd been doing some recording, including one with a woman born in the 1880s, and with a very strong memory of her upbringing and education and different jobs. And she was a bit deaf, so it was quite difficult to stop and ask her anything, so I just let it all flow for a long time, and until it got on to a foster child and her fussy eating habits in the 20s, so I moved back. But we learnt on the go, tape recording. There weren't classes, there weren't books. You learnt to listen. You heard other people's tapes where they kept interrupting and not letting the person finish their point. So you, by listening to bad examples, that helped you practice better.
So there was
and I think discussing them, people would bring tapes into the group meeting, and we'd listen to them and we'd discuss them, and that kind of collective feedback was very important as well.
And the makeup of the group was interesting, because we advertised it in the Hackney Gazette, and there were 3 school students from Hackney Down School who came along, and a couple of them were still involved, Neil Marston being one of them, 52 years later. Ian Build, another one, went down to Bristol and set up Bristol Rural Sites. Barry and Barbara Burke, Barry was my Hackney librarian, Anna Davin, of course. Laurie Elks is thanked in the introduction, so Laurie must have played a small part. Albert Cunnington, twice Mayor of Hackney, and he was a great framer of the kind of the period, and particularly around the Labour, literally the formation of the Labour Party in Hackney, the Independent Labour Party, and so on. Richard Gray, another Hackney teacher. Paul Lucky, painter and decorator, who was all very interested in Hackney history, partly because he went into people's houses redecorating, and he got very interested in that. Ken Jacobs, a postman, again another amateur, very, very interested in kind of the material culture. I mean, he wouldn't have said it, the material culture of Hackney, its architecture and street life and so on. And Israel Renson, a pharmacist in Brick Lane, who was very interested in kind of health issues, and a member of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, which was already then becoming fairly rare. So it was that kind of. It's very good to look back on that for me, because it is about how these things kind of happen, like the Hackney, History Festival. They're not planned. So no one single person has an idea or something. It comes and then it has to kind of negotiate its way into the future, and that's what we were doing. So if we have the next. Yeah, so this was the first pamphlet we did. So we interviewed, I think, about 10 people who had very profound memories of Dr Jelley. As I say, the common one initially was the fact that he went by horse everywhere, and he would always give a child a penny or a farthing really to look after the horse while he went inside. He only charged threepence for a consultation when, as Anna, I'm sure, will briefly say in a minute, the panel, before the panel of doctors was invented, doctors would charge, not anything less than £half a crown, and would have to be really for, they were not respected people, they were feared people, literally, because they also had the power of life and death over you in many ways. So we had about 10 of those stories. And 10 years later, a theatre group called the Inner City Theatre Group in Hackney wrote a play, a musical actually, about Dr Jelley, and they toured people's homes with it. And that, again, was very successful, and that brought in more stories about the marvellous Dr Jelley. So if we have the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the, as Aud will say, a shilling of life will give you all the facts. So he was born in Totnes, moved to Hackney to the 172 High Street in 1911. Now, I didn't know, we know nothing about what happened in between, but 8 years ago, I had an email from Czechoslovakia by a man who was editing his grandfather's diaries. His grandfather was a man called Edwin Butler, who his grandson claimed had invented a different kind of bicycle, which had become quite popular. But in these diaries, there was quite a lot of mention of his good friend Henry Percy Jelley. And I was able then to get a picture that actually he tried farming for a couple of decades before going to Glasgow University and retraining as a doctor. So he comes to Hackney and opens up a surgery. Marries for the second time. His first wife had died, leaving him 2 children, and becomes immediately very, very popular. But in 1912, he opens a so-called lying-in hospital in Homerton, in a disused bootblacking factory. And we've got someone in a minute who remembers that they worked there. And the police became suspicious a bit fairly early on, because a few women went in there pregnant and they came out, without children. And it was run by Jelley, his wife's sister, and 2 paid nurses. So it must have been quite an ambitious kind of hospital for pregnant women. But in 1916, he was arrested because a woman had died, had been taken from there into Homerton Hospital, and had died from complications around birth. And the police investigated it, and he arrested him, and he was charged with murder, actually. It was almost a national sensation, the court trial, because of his popularity. I mean, literally, it is said that while he was waiting in prison to be tried, he received 3,000 letters of support from people in the East End of London. So this is one of those things we will never know. I mean, he was also irascible, occasionally violent, and not afraid of picking a fight with people in the street who, if he thought they had disabused themselves of him. So not an easy person to kind of summarise. So he did go to prison and was let out after 2 years. He was a model prisoner. And yeah, he was discharged in 1919, unable to practice, although he was able to give advice, which he did, and he did it through the means or apparatus of a double-fronted shop that had a tailoring, garment making, repairs work in one side, and a vegetable shop in the other side. Now, the vegetable shop is kind of interesting because, as we'll see in a minute, he was acute enough to know that often the problem was the poor diet of many people's illnesses. And he would sometimes say, well, cut out all that sugar, here's some money, go and buy some vegetables. So if we can have the next slide, please.
People also remembered him saying, what I should prescribe you is a steak.
Right. Well, you can read this one. Yeah. He did a lot of good. He ran his own hospital opposite St Barnabas Church in High Street, Homerton. Berry's Boot Polish used to run a factory, and they moved out, and Dr Jelley moved in, and they had that as a lying-in hospital. That cost 1/6
Does everybody know what lying in means? It was the term used for when a woman went in because she was already in labour or was getting towards giving birth.
He had staff in there, his wife, his sister, and 1 or 2 ward maids. And the next slide. This is one of the drawings from the theatre programme of Dr Jelley on his horse riding, and often riding at speed and with a whip, cracking both sides of the road just to make sure nobody got in his way. A very difficult person. And the next slide, please. This is Arthur Welling's. He used to go over to Marion Street with his bucket. Give us a bucket of coal, he'd say, and they'd give it to him. When he got to the houses, if they weren't up to it, he'd get down on his hands and knees, rake out all of the ashes, and light the fire for them in their own bedrooms. And when it came to paying, he'd say, I don't want your bloody money, buy the kids some food. So, I mean, he's a very complicated character. He has this immensely generous, warm streak towards the working classes, but an absolute intolerant hatred of all forms of authority, including the police. He had many, many run-ins in the police. Were there other things that you picked up from?
I was about to say that.
Huh? Oh.
I totally agree. The attitude to authority,
Yeah.
and the run-ins with police, they were almost manufactured. He liked to provoke problems.
And what do you know a bit more about how, if you couldn't go to doctor, if you couldn't have the Threepenny Doctor, you'd have to have presumably health insurance, or
It was only male trade union members who had some level of insurance cover.
so women would just have to go. Yeah.
They might be able to get it through their husband's rights to it, especially if they've been widowed.
And when did hospitals, I mean, all the hospitals have these big kind of annual.
Well, the hospitals were run through the poor law usually, but some of them were private. But the general structure was that, and there's still the same buildings.
Yeah, well, they are. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can still see St Pancras Hospital, for instance, is an old workhouse set of buildings. But and it just makes you realise, as usual, thank goodness for the National Health Service, but that's post the Second World War, and we're talking about before and during the First World War, when medical provision was scant, it was expensive, it wasn't necessarily much good either, and it exposed you to authority at many different levels. And I think, as a doctor, he'd seen a lot of that, and his indignation, and there's no record of him being violent with poor people.
No.
I think it's only with authority.
No. Or that he wasn't that keen on children who threw things at him in the street. I mean,
Dr Jelley.
So we have the next slide. So he had to kind of diversify, really, to keep going after he had been banned from practicing as a medic. Yeah. So he bought a car, and this was another person we interviewed who had sold him a car, although he also had a charabanc as well. He bought a car off me, a 7-seater Renault, and he used to take the old girls to Southend. He used to charge them a shilling and give them a Guinness. This was around 1928. He always wore a beautiful bowler hat. If you wanted to comb your hair, you could use his bowler. You would see your face in it. It was that shiny. So again, we're getting a completely kind of complicated picture, because other earlier memories of him was that although he kind of seemed, he had a top hat and he rode a horse and he had a frock coat, in other ways he was pretty ramshackle. And if we have the next. And so he had a kind of, his son would make up the medicines and he would see people in this shop. But At one point he claimed that he was seeing 300 people a day. And again, we can't really know whether to believe him or not. But the popularity he had was tremendous. And the next one.
I've got a little bit of coach story.
Yeah, go on.
A short time after Dr Jelley came out of prison, this Mrs. Philo, who's somebody I recorded, it's a transcript of an interview with her, he decided to go into the motor coach industry, and he bought 1 or 2 motor coaches. He put his son in charge of them to run the poor people down to Southend for £0.50. Well, Mother thought she'd go on a day's outing, so she took her mother, who wasn't young anymore, and my brother. I think my brother was charged half price. The coach was filled, and when they got into it, they realised it was not the essence of luxury. There were hard wooden seats, and my mother said that when she looked through the floorboards of the coach, she could see the road. Halfway there, the coach broke down, and they had to go into a garage to have it seen to, and by the time they got to Southend, owing to this delay, it was almost time to come back. Mother said that everybody enjoyed themselves. It was one scream, because people were singing and wanted to throw tomatoes, but they dare not because of the return journey. Anyway, coming back, the same thing happened again, and when they looked at the tyres, they were all peeling off like orange peel. So all the passengers started peeling the tyres because they thought it was a memento, you see. It doesn't say how they actually got them.
We have the Evening Times at the period has an article about the marriage of Dr Jelley, his second wife, when he arrived in Hackney in 1911. He immediately fell in love with someone. This was called, the headline was Homerton Wedding Scenes. Today saw the happy realisation of a love romance between a people's doctor and the daughter of a bootmaker. By special licence, the nuptials were celebrated of Dr Jelley and Miss Florrie Glenham at St Barnabas Church, Homerton. Homerton made a real gala day of it. Crowds began to gather quite an hour before the ceremony, and at 1 o'clock they were so thick in the neighbourhood of the church that it was with difficulty the police were able to regulate the traffic. The majority of them were women who had brought with them nearly the whole of the infant population, either in arms or in mail carts. The ceremony was a simple one. There was no music of any kind. When the service was over, Dr Jelley and his bride walked arm in arm, ringing out bells. When the service was over, Dr Jelley and his bride walked arm in arm slowly down the pathway, through the gates and along the main road to their home. They were cheered and pelted with confetti, and as they progressed slowly along, they were followed by an ever-increasing and hilarious crowd. Handkerchiefs were waved from windows and from housetops. The romance, briefly told, is that about 8 months ago they chanced to walk into the surgery of Dr Jelley, High Street, Homerton, a bright-looking, dark-complexioned young lady. The doctor, even before ascertaining her errand, fell in love with her. The secret he kept to himself until 3 months ago. Miss Glenham, the lady in question, is of humble circumstances, her father being a well-known bootmaker in the district. Dr Henry Percy Jelley, to give him his full title, is a gentleman about 45 years of age, while his bride is 17. The doctor only went to reside in the neighbourhood about 12 months ago, when he started his present practice, and he is known far and wide as a Threepenny Doctor. If we look at the next, I think it's the last slide. Yeah, he was famous. In fact, Harry Champion, who's probably one of the most famous musical singers, sang a song about him, composed again by 2 other luminaries of the musical songbook, Edgar Bateman and Humphrey Trevor, called Dr Shelley. And I will read you the lyrics of the song. I'm Shelley, good old Dr Shelley. No matter what complaint you've got, I can cure you on the spot. If you've got a nasty pain in your Derby, Kelly, trot your tummy round to me, good old Dr Shelley. You see in me the doctor who has won a great renown. I only charge a tanner at cash instead of half a crown. I cure the rats, the whooping cough, the measles or the flu. You can pay me by instalments if you give an IOU. I'm Shelley, good old Dr Jelley. No matter what complaint you've got, I can cure you on the spot. If you've got a nasty pain in your Derby Kelly, trot your tummy round to me, good old Dr Jelley. So it's I've kind of thought long hard, because it's interesting, the very academic essay about him in the medical journal, it was clear that the woman there was having a lot of trouble making up her mind whether he was a kind of slightly deranged man who, well, actually in some ways, not to be a pun, but Dr. Mr. Jelley or Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, but you know, he had very two sides to him. This genuine philanthropist who was there to help the Hackney poor, together with an irascible, slightly exploitative and occasionally brutal young man, because he didn't inquire after the woman who was taken from his lying in hospital into Homerton who died, about on whose death, it was about whose death he was arrested. He never asked about her. He kind of just put a block that out of the story of his life, so to speak. So he kind of had to negotiate lots of issues about how the medical profession, of course, loathed him, and there were some people who really were very suspicious about him. But on the whole, he did kind of become this beloved figure in Hackney, and we weren't there are lots more extracts from what people have said about Jelley in this one, which came out in 1984, because we did more work afterwards since, and it's no longer available. But I might try and get it and put it online. I mean, it is very rich material. But that was one of the kind of thing that we happened upon in beginning this. But it was a kind of unknown journey into Hackney's past working class history. I think the first book we ever published before Dr Jelley was a shoemaker's autobiography called Years of Change. And that was a Homerton-based book where Arthur Newton, who, a lovely man, I interviewed him several times, he had 9 brothers, and they lived, and he still lived in the house, and it's still there. It's in a tiny square just off of road beginning with C, a big Market Street road. Chatsworth Road. Yeah. So he and his 9 brothers and their father made up shoes in the house. And on Friday, which was shop day, Arthur and a couple of others would take them, to the factor, who would then arrange for them to go into the wholesaler. But that was all homework. I mean, 9 men in this case, working at home and so on. So we began to realise that, just really the skills of the work. The rag trade was another one, obviously, and eventually we did quite a lot of work around what was known as the Dax factory, but the big factory in Stone Newington High Street. And what's it called?
Simpsons.
Simpsons? Yeah.
Simpsons.
Yeah. Which had 3,000 employers at its height. The other big industry was called furnishing, veneering, furniture making. And again, these are really highly skilled jobs. So, and I think the other thing is that family life was really stretched. I hadn't realised the degree to which, I would say at least a third of the people I interviewed said they had not been brought up by their parents because their parents couldn't afford them. So they, if a third child or fourth child came along, the parents would ask an aunt or an uncle or even a neighbour to bring them up. So, that kind of, there was much more, as it were, collective child care or child rearing than we might see or expect today.
It was also done by, would have been done until compulsory school comes in the 1870s. Older children looked after younger children, and a big family was actually valued.
Yeah.
There was a lot of changing around across households. A child might be sent to live with an old lady who needed company overnight, for instance, or help. It was addressing a lot of different problems that the flexible boundaries of the household.
Yeah. And were there other things that you kind of remember that you picked up from, you know, the work with the People's Autobiography group that either were new to you or that you found that there was a sort of a richness to the material that
I was certainly, yes.
yeah. Do you remember what they were?
No, it's 50 years ago. And I did subsequently write a book called Growing Up Poor, and a lot of it, the examples in there, I did draw from not just our group, but other history going on, like the Raphael sermons.
Was that one of the Routledge series?
Yes.
Oh, right. And when was that?
No, sorry, no, it wasn't. It was with Azora,
Right.
1994, I think.
Called?
Growing Up Poor.
Okay.
Home, school and street in London before 1914, something like that.
And I wonder why...
I didn't mean to plug it.
No, I was. I wanted you to.
A lot of these things we're touching on are developed in like flexible households.
Yeah. I mean...
And shared childcare and a degree of autonomy for children.
It's interesting why that enormous 1972 history workshop gathering, the Ruskin gathering, was about childhood. I mean, it did a lot
Guess
of...
who was one of the organisers?
Oh yeah. And
Because I'd already started. I started my thesis work in 1917, finished in the mid-90s, because there was such a lot of interesting things to do.
Yeah.
But
there were a
yes,
lot of teachers there.
There were.
Yeah,
I
and
thought it was more than 500, by the way.
it probably was, yeah.
I would have said 1,000.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Maybe that 500 kind of slept on the floors overnight. But, I mean, there was.
Everyone came with sleeping bags, and we'd got lists of people who were prepared to have somebody come and occupy their floor. And the Dominican House Blackfriars took people in, but I think only chaps possibly. And there were so many sessions that we had to move out of Ruskin and have repeat sessions so people who hadn't been able to fit in could hear them somewhere else, in the local theatre, the Playhouse, the Oxford Union even, all sorts of places let premises be used for extra. It was a festival. It was quite extraordinary.
I know, I mean, I got there rather too early. I mean, I travelled up on the train, and I was booked to sleep on the floor of Balliol College. I'd never been to Oxford before. I went into the common room of Balliol College rather early, and the normal residents of Balliol College were still there, and I didn't feel very comfortable. I went home. I went to the pub. But it was that strange kind of suddenly.
It was very
Balliol, you know, like all these men and women with sleeping bags and, you know, occasionally kids and so on. But childhood, I'm thinking a lot about childhood at the moment because this year is the centenary of the death and the birth, of the anarchist Colin Ward. And I'm doing quite a lot of work about that at the moment. And I mean, it's interesting that I've claimed, and I think this is becoming the consensus, that the great achievement of Colin Ward, of many of his achievements, was that he put the sovereign child at the kind of heart of anarchist politics, you know, that, you know, you can't have a free society if you don't take children seriously and their freedom seriously. It's so interesting that that's such an amazing Ruskin gathering.
But another part of that was the previous year, I think it would have been, was the big women's history workshop, which had been going to be the first annual conference of the women's liberation movement, and which I was involved in. And several of us historians wanted to organise a women's history workshop at Ruskin. We were part of all of that. But in fact, our non-historian sisters said, no, we need it to be not just history, it's got to be a proper movement conference, so that's what it was, and that became, and that had a lot of influence in the college on chaps who'd not been exposed to much of this kind. It wasn't they didn't know militant women, it was a trade union college, obviously they knew strong women, both at home and at work and in organising, but they hadn't kind of put things together, and they were a bit shocked when Sheila Rowbottom proposed we if anybody there wanted to have a sub meeting on women. Some of the male Ruskin students jeered and said ha ha ha, and had to be taken to task, and became very penitent after we'd had a word or two. So I think there's a continuity going on between straightforward politics, it's perhaps not quite the right word, the women's movement, labour movement already existing, all sorts of alternative groupings developing, and History Workshop, it's as a movement, was also going on through the teaching of Raphael Samuel in Ruskin College to adult students, a lot more men than women, although that was beginning to change. And what he was doing was sidestepping the conventional curriculum and methods, and saying, tell me about when you were growing up to people, tell me about your first job, or getting economic and social history from people to challenge the more formal and conventional and conservative history, which I must say had still been being taught at the Oxford High School. It was terrible, the history teacher. Would never have become a historian out of that. It was other influences completely.
Can I see, invite
Of
questions
course,
generally
of course,
about any of this?
Have you found any photographs of Dr Jelley?
Only the kind of, I don't think it is the police photograph.
Just to give you a sense of the personality.
Yeah. Sorry.
I did want to add another thing about his gynecological attentions, and one of the women I recorded said he was a very generous man. It wasn't just the low fees or the waived fees even, but he took pity on women in their troubles, and this was code for he helped them have abortions, and I think that was part of the huge following of women that he had, because it was illegal, and I think even the case which he was in prison for, which was manslaughter, I think, rather than murder, but that might have been connected.
It was the original charge was wilful murder, but he was convicted of manslaughter.
Right.
But he only served 2 years.
Yeah.
As a retired lawyer, I think that was very mean of the police to charge him with murder, because murder involves an intention to do serious harm. It should have been a manslaughter charge in the first place, so that rather underlines the feeling between him and the police.
Yeah.
Jerry, you had a question, I think.
Yes, I mean, it's not about Jelley directly, but if the project was restarted today, who and what trades might we be talking to?
Well, you're probably better, people in here better know that than I do. I don't want to be sarcastic. I'm thinking of kind of babering and baking. I know, but I won't answer that directly. Hopefully someone in the audience can. But coming back, because what also helps this is going back to the new technology. The first thing we ever did at Hackney Downs was literally duplicated. The next thing was, we heard this offset litho,
No, the first thing is that pink ink with a bed of jelly.
With a bed of jelly, or green jelly or pink jelly,
Where the paper reproduced by, I don't understand it actually, Some of you may remember it used to be used quite late on in nursery schools and schools because it was so cheap.
Yeah, that was displaced by
And then you get the
duplicating.
duplicate.
Yeah, and then you got offset litho, but photographs were very expensive because photographs had to be screened and broken down into millions of dots before they could be printed. So that was very expensive. You had to print the photographs separate from the type and so on. And so there were two printers who kind of all, in this period, this early 70s, kind of the radicals gravitated towards. Expression Pinch was in just off of Balls Pond Road, where Ian Sinclair got all his early stuff done. And then we would take that down to the far end of Dawson Junction, just round the bend, very near here actually. No, not there. Just round the bend, where there was a binding company, but they mostly did pulp. So you kind of went to this very noisy factory where these machines were binding and stapling and gluing and everything, but all these magazines came up, and occasionally a little work of radical feminist history would come through the mill. It was bizarre. But the technology, again, was very important.
Yeah. I've got a question about Jelley. You said there's a gap in the information about him between, the late 19th century and up to 1911. Are you saying that nobody knows, or it's clear he had no medical training?
No, he did have medical training, but I think it came late. He had tried farming, according to the diaries of Edwin Butler, and then had gone to Glasgow University, where he did pass. I think he only just scraped through one of the exams on midwifery, possibly. But no, he did go. Yeah. But the mystery is that what happened. 1928 is the last any of our interviewees remember him being in Hackney. But he didn't die until 1944, and what happened in between then, we don't know. I mean, he must also, several people referred to the fact that he also had another shop at the edge of the corner of Roe Hill Street and Lower Clapton Road, which I think was a car showroom at one point. So he was, he was always got some trade or business going in order to keep going.
There must have been some press stories about his...
Well,
yes. Did you not think, did you have some Daily Mirror cuttings or something?
yes, they're in my copy, but I'm in the middle of moving a house, downsizing after 30 years, and my People's History stuff was packed up before Ken rang and said, was I interested in joining him? But my copy has lots of Daily Mirror cutting letters. There's a little spurt of them in the, I don't remember when actually, I don't remember the dates.
Well, 1916 for the trial. And,
yeah, but my letters.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question, Ken. I did an interview of a woman in Leighton who remembered him going around on a horse, and that must have been 72 or 73. She wouldn't have remembered if it had been pre-war. Did he not go around on his horse after war as well as having his?
I think he did go. Yes, I think he carried on with the horse, but the charabanc and the car were other, other things that he did. Because his son was his chauffeur and his driver. One of the memories in the book is that the pamphlet really. A woman we spoke to said that he came to where they were working to offer. He offered them, any one of them, £100 to marry his son, and none of them took it up. I think. But so yeah, I guess the second half of his life was spent kind of running these kind of shops and giving a bit of advice, at some point retiring possibly out of Hackney, but he does disappear from a kind of public record.
There's an advert in the Hackney Gazette to say that he'd been to visit a girl named Florrie and she was to be his wife. So they were using the local press in that way as well, and that was why everyone knew about the wedding. Some of us girls went to see the wedding. We were not allowed into the church because we weren't wearing hats, so we saw the wedding from outside. It was said that people were not only sitting on the seats but standing because it was so crowded.
In answer to your question, Jerry, I think the thing that would be exceptionally rewarding is just not quite too late to gather in recollections of the rag trade, the small workshops. I mean, the rag trade died in Hackney in the 80s, going into the 90s. So there are undoubtedly people around who worked in these little shops, initially for Jewish bosses, latterly mostly for Turkish bosses. But you know, time's running out to do that, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, when we did the shoemakers autobiography, I think 1973, years of change, there was still a trade union office for shoemakers in just behind Hackney Town Hall, and that was a really big industry in Hackney. It all went up to Leicestershire or down to the West Country, Somerset.
Do you still have any of the original tapes?
No, and this
I
is.
have a few.
I do. Well,
They can be cleaned up quite easily now in terms of the audio.
But there was a disaster when somebody broke into the Centre Prize and they took all the tapes to reuse, and we didn't know about how you could prevent that by putting a pencil in the hole in the middle, and then they couldn't be reused. But so quite a lot of stuff was lost then, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yes.
Can I just ask about, after Jelley had graduated from Glasgow, is there any record of where he worked, and did he work as a doctor before? Where did he come to Hackney from?
Glasgow.
Straight from Glasgow?
Straight from Glasgow.
So he hadn't practised anywhere?
No.
Thank you.
I think he'd been at Glasgow University, and I think he may have spent 1 or 2 years in the Glasgow hospital, but then came straight to Hackney. I don't know why. And
it does seem to me, just from what you were saying, that there is something that could be done to retrieve what tapes survive, and as you say, it is now possible to clean up the audio and make it much more clear than you might imagine, and to even douse down the budgerigar song and the crockery, just to sort of concentrate on the voice. And by the way, you were talking about the story of cassettes wiping mysteriously on the tube. So I worked in BBC Radio, and when I started using cassettes, we were told, whatever you do, don't put your cassette recorder in a bag on the floor of the tube station, because the magnetism could wipe it. And from time to time, inevitably, I forgot, and I did put my bag down. It never damaged my tapes. I'm fairly sure this was an alibi invented by somebody who'd gone out to do an important interview and come back to the office with a blank cassette, which happens to us all. But I'm also interested in Jelley, because I mean, it's a wonderfully, as you say, it's a wonderfully vivid and rich account. I'm still struggling to work out what his motivation was. He wasn't religious, he wasn't evangelical, there's nothing to indicate he was political, he certainly wasn't in it for the money. So was this about philanthropy? Was it about status in the community? Was it about social purpose? What do you think actually motivated him?
That's a big dilemma. I mean, I really don't know. I mean, he was very, very busy all the time. So he had a car. He had a car and a horse, and I suppose he dressed fairly well. But he had these shops. So he didn't have any he didn't have any professional kind of wanted to be regarded with esteem, because he would literally be sometimes boiling up potatoes in a saucepan in the surgery. So we've got two people here.
This
about to
paragraph
answer it.
refers to it. If you thought you were taking him on or you were coming it, he was finished with you. He would just tell you to bloody well go to your own doctor. If he visited a patient and they couldn't pay him, it didn't matter. He wasn't a wealthy man, and needless to say, he was despised by all the other medical profession in the district and everywhere else. They just despised him naturally because he had a very good following. So the sort of competition between who he was and who they were comes back to the resentment of authority and privilege,
Yeah.
I think,
I mean, I guess,
but expressed very personally.
yeah, I mean, it may well have been if he was, badly, some traumatic thing happened when he was training to be a doctor, at Glasgow, or he was put down in some terrible way and he decided he would.
Or do we know how his first wife died? Could that have been a death in childbirth?
No.
He might have just been a very kind person. There was another doctor called Dr Harrison who operated near Lincoln, and he was the first person to offer free treatment, and it was really just because he just despised the idea of medics only being available for the rich, and he had studied in Edinburgh, and he went privately and treated the sick, and it was a very strong personal belief and message. And
Well,
it
Dr.
sounds
Salt,
like he was the
yeah.
same.
Well, Dr. Salter in Birmingham,
Yes.
but I mean,
Yeah.
he was very politically,
Yeah, and he was articulate
Yeah.
and
It
active.
doesn't
such
But the-
necessarily
as-
need
Yeah.
to be political
No,
in that sense.
no.
There was just this a generosity of
Yeah.
spirit and loathing
Yeah.
of the privileged.
Do you know anything about his family history? I mean,
No,
There's a little bit in that article that you were
Right.
showing me before, but,
okay.
about what his father, I think his father might have been a pharmacist.
Yes, yes, and they came from, Totnes, they came from the West Coast.
yeah, but
Yeah.
I just wonder what his family did.
Did
Yes.
local churches support his work?
We don't know. I suspect not,
But
because
he did get married in church, and the working girls round the corner couldn't come in because they had no hats.
that's right, yes. Do you think that was the church prescription, or?
I don't know, most likely.
I suspect that some of the girls would have been quite cheerful and merry. Yeah.
2 points. Is there any record of the trial or any speeches made at the trial? Because that's sometimes useful.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody wants to take this up and do volume 2 or whatever, I mean, I agree that I'm not so good in the archives, and it would be possible for someone to do some really thorough archival research. With the guy had his medical training. He was in prison. He was there was a national scandalous court appearance and so on. It should be possible for someone to do that. But, although strangely, the woman who wrote quite a long piece in the Journal of Medical History didn't find out that much more, and was actually quite reliant on how people saw him in Hackney, on basically the stuff we put together. Which, by the way, there is a lot more. It sounds as though we only interviewed 3 people, but there were a lot more. There's quite a lot more. But I didn't want to spend time reading up. But it's great stuff, and it kind of it really cemented the project, I think, in part. Within Hackney as important piece of social history.
Do Hackney libraries have copies of these things?
I suspect the archives would certainly have that one and possibly this one. I'm not sure if someone said that they could once found one of these on eBay. But, yeah.
That's likely.
Do you want someone to help you put it online, or do you have the technical gear to do that at home?
If anybody wanted to do that, I'd be more than happy to do it. I'm pretty, preoccupied at the moment. Yeah. So no, that would be wonderful because, I mean, even my grandson managed, you know, amazingly to turn some typesetting, scanned it and put it into a Word document so I could kind of re-edit it. But I mean, that's beyond me. We have a, you know, I have a very clean copy of all the memories here.
If it were put on the Hackney Society website, it's slightly random in a sense.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
we'll do something about that. Any more? My own question, Andrew. I think there's such a thing as a lovable old curmudgeon. You know, I think. Feels like that. You know, he was irascible and bad-tempered and unpredictable, but you know, was full of desire to do good work.
And in a way, you've got to be kind of not angular, but you've got to, you know, the poverty that he would have seen, the conditions in which people lived, and the children lived, in which he would see in the multi-occupied slums that he was visiting. You've got to be made of pretty strong stuff. And in some, and a lot of people who are made of pretty strong stuff, you know, themselves, as Brett said, you know, we could, you know, who wanted to be kind could not be kind ourselves. You know, you have, you know, those people have to have certain kinds of blockages and elbows and unassimilated to be unassimilable.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't realise it was going to be such a double act. I previewed Weekend, and I apologise, Anna, for not doing so. I think that was great. That was everything I hoped for. We do have another talk next month by Julia Lafferty about an even more scandalous character, the Reverend Smith Piggott, who was around the Agapemonite Church in Stamford Hill, and his numerous spiritual brides. So he was one of those charismatic characters with a strange animal magnetism. This has a very small capacity, this venue, as you know, although I think you agree it's rather special. So if you want to come to that, get on with it and book on Eventbrite.